The air at the Henderson Farm auction was thick with the ghosts of failure. It was late October 1979, and a bitter wind whipped across the picked-clean cornfields of central Iowa, carrying the scent of decay and diesel. Men stood in tight clusters, hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces grim under the brims of their seed corn caps. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to pick over the bones of a neighbor who had reached too far, too fast. Jedediah Stone stood apart from the others, his worn Carhartt jacket pulled tight against the chill. He wasn't a vulture. He was here to bear witness and maybe, just maybe, find a piece of iron that still had some life in it. His own farm, a modest quarter section his grandfather had broken with a team of mules, was paid for. His machinery, a John Deere 4020 with over 10,000 hours on the clock and an old Farmall M for lighter work, was his. Not his and the bank's. Just his. This simple fact made him an outcast in the new era of aggressive expansion. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a frantic, mesmerizing drone, echoed off the side of the big machine shed. Harrows, cultivators, and planters went for pennies on the dollar. Jed watched them go, his keen eyes assessing wear on the discs, welds on the frames. He let them pass. He was waiting for the heart of the operation. Then they dragged it out. A collective murmur went through the crowd, a mix of awe and pity. It was a big bud. An HN 320 painted a faded, sun-blistered red that might have once been vibrant. It was a titan, a leviathan of steel and rubber built for the vast wheat fields of Montana, not the rolling hills of Iowa. Its 8 massive tires, each taller than a man, were cracked and worn. One of the fronts was completely flat, the rim sinking into the muddy ground like a tombstone. The articulated joint sagged, weeping hydraulic fluid. The twin chrome exhaust stacks were pitted with rust. It was a monument to a broken dream. Frank Miller, whose new 400-horsepower Steiger was the talk of the county, let out a loud, derisive laugh. "Look at that thing," he boomed to the men around him. "Henderson thought he was going to plow the whole damn state with that monster. Bet it hasn't run in a year." Mr. Caldwell, the banker from town, stood beside the auctioneer, his city suit and polished shoes looking painfully out of place. He had a clipboard in his hand and a sour expression on his face. This tractor represented the biggest single loss on his books for this foreclosure. He just wanted it gone. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer hollered, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. "The Big Bud HN 320. Got the Cummins KTA 1150 under the hood, 1,000 gallons of fuel capacity. Think of the acres you can turn with this beast. What'll you give me? Who'll start the bidding at 20,000? 10. Somebody give me $5,000 for this piece of American iron." Silence. The wind howled. Frank Miller snorted again. "You'd be lucky to get scrap price for it, Caldwell. Parts are impossible to find, and it'll drink a 55-gallon drum of diesel just to start up." The auctioneer looked desperately at Caldwell, who gave a slight, defeated nod. "Scrap price it is, then. I got a bid of 2,000 from the junkyard. Do I hear 2,100? 2,100 to keep this giant out of the scrapyard furnace?" Jed felt a strange pull. He saw past the flat tire and the rust. He saw the sheer, raw power sleeping inside that massive engine block. He saw the heavy-gauge steel frame that wouldn't twist or crack like the newer, lighter machines. He saw potential where everyone else saw a liability. He had cash in the bank, saved from 3 good years of corn prices. It was his family's cushion, the rainy day fund. His wife, Sarah, would kill him. But the words came out of his mouth before he could stop them. 2,500, he said, his voice quiet but clear in a lull in the wind. Every head turned to look at him. Frank Miller's jaw dropped in disbelief before twisting into a smirk. "Well, looky here. Stone's going to buy himself a new anchor for his rowboat." Caldwell the banker squinted at Jed, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He'd hoped for more, but he knew a losing hand when he saw one. "I've got 2,500 from Jed Stone. Do I hear 3,000? The crowd was silent, watching the unfolding drama. This was better than a bad harvest for town gossip. Jed Stone, the man who pinched every penny, was bidding on the biggest, most impractical tractor in the state. "Sold," the auctioneer finally yelled, slamming his gavel down on his palm, "for $2,500 to Jedediah Stone." A wave of quiet laughter rippled through the farmers. Jed ignored it. He walked toward the auctioneer's stand, his face a mask of calm determination. He pulled a worn leather checkbook from his inside pocket and wrote out the check, the ink freezing on the paper. Caldwell took it from him, barely glancing at the name. "She's all yours, Stone," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "including the 2 tons of flat rubber and the puddle of oil underneath her. Good luck getting her off the property." Jed just nodded, folded the bill of sale and tucked it away. He turned and walked toward his prize, his folly, his new beginning. The laughter and whispers followed him like a cloud of flies. He didn't care. He ran a calloused hand over the cold steel of the massive fender, feeling the deep, resonant hum of potential that only he could hear. Now, before we get into the sweat and grease of how Jed planned to resurrect this fallen giant, I have to ask you folks listening. Have you ever come across a piece of old iron, a car, a tractor, a tool that everyone else had written off as junk? Something you saw a soul in, a second life that nobody else could see? Tell me about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories about the treasures you've saved from the scrap heap. Getting the Big Bud home was a war fought on 3 fronts: air, leverage, and sheer stubbornness. The first battle was with the front left tire. It was a 30.532 Goodyear, and it lay on the ground like a beached whale, the rim digging a deep, muddy grin into the earth. Frank Miller and a few others had hung around, leaning against their shiny new pickups, just to watch the show. "Gonna need a crane for that, Jed," Miller shouted, a wide grin on his face. Jed didn't answer. He backed his old International pickup, a 68 with a 3-speed on the column, up to the tractor. Bolted to the truck's bed was a heavy-duty air compressor he'd rigged to run off a PTO shaft. He fired up the truck's straight 6, and the compressor began its rhythmic thump, 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 slowly building pressure in its tank. First, he had to break the bead. The tire had been flat so long it was practically vulcanized to the rim. He took a sledgehammer and a bead-breaking wedge and went to work. The metallic clang of steel on steel echoed across the empty farmyard. It was brutal, punishing work. Sweat soaked through his shirt, despite the cold. After an hour, the bead finally gave way with a groan of tortured rubber. Next, the lift. He didn't have a crane. He had his John Deere 4020, a logging chain, and a couple of heavy-duty hydraulic jacks that looked like they belonged on a railroad. He positioned the 4020 on the opposite side of the Big Bud, ran the chain over the top of the massive tractor's frame, and hooked it to the flat tire's rim. Using the 4020's hydraulics as a makeshift winch, he slowly, carefully began to lift the immense wheel assembly, while simultaneously working the jacks under the axle. It was a dangerous, delicate ballet of old machinery. A slipped chain or a failed jack would mean disaster. Miller and his cronies fell silent, watching with a kind of morbid fascination. With the wheel finally off the ground, Jed found the problem. A 3-inch bolt had punched clean through the tread, shredding the inner tube. He spent the next 4 hours patching the tube with a hot patch kit, wrestling the heavy, unwieldy rubber back onto the rim and slowly filling it with air. The tire creaked and groaned as it seated itself on the bead with a series of loud pops that made the onlookers jump. By the time the sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard, the Big Bud was sitting on 8 inflated tires. It still looked like hell, but it was a standing giant now, not a fallen one. Frank Miller just shook his head, climbed into his truck, and drove away without a word. The 5-mile journey home was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl. The Big Bud's engine was dead, its batteries long since surrendered to the cold. Jed used the 4020 to tow it, the smaller tractor straining against the immense dead weight. The logging chain was stretched bar-tight, groaning with every bump in the road. Jed had Sarah in the cab of the Big Bud, her small hands gripping the massive steering wheel, trying to keep the articulated beast tracking straight. They moved at a walking pace, a strange procession of old and older, a testament to one man's refusal to quit. When they finally pulled into their own yard, long after dark, they were exhausted, filthy, and bone-tired. Sarah looked at the behemoth that now dominated their property, dwarfing their barn and house. "Jedediah," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "what have you done?" "I bought us a chance, Sarah," he said, looking up at the tractor's silhouette against the starry sky. "That's all." The barn became Jed's sanctuary and his crucible. For the next year, every spare moment, every dollar, went into the big bud. He started with the engine, that legendary Cummins KTAL 150. It was a 16-litre, 6-cylinder monster, and it hadn't turned over in what looked like years. He drained the oil, and it came out thick and black as tar, full of sludge and misery. He pulled the cylinder head, a piece of cast iron so heavy he had to use a chain hoist just to lift it. The sight inside was not encouraging. Water had seeped past a bad gasket on number 5 cylinder. The cylinder wall was a mess of rust and pitting. Any other man would have given up, called the scrapyard himself. Jed just set his jaw and went to work. He pulled the piston and liner. He spent a week honing the cylinder bore with a ball hone, meticulously cleaning and measuring, until the surface was smooth and true again. He ordered a new liner, piston and ring set from a specialty supplier in Minneapolis, a purchase that made him and Sarah eat beans and potatoes for a month. While he waited for parts, he turned his attention to the fuel system. He pulled all 6 massive injectors, each one the size of a small hammer. He disassembled them on his clean workbench, carefully laying out each tiny spring and valve on a clean rag. He cleaned the nozzles with special wires, soaked the bodies in carburetor cleaner until they gleamed, and reassembled them with the precision of a watchmaker. He rebuilt the PT fuel pump, replacing gaskets and diaphragms that had turned to brittle plastic. The talk at the co-op was relentless. "Heard Jed Stone's trying to rebuild that Cummins himself," one farmer would say, stirring his coffee. "Heard he's in over his head. Thinks he's some kind of diesel mechanic." Frank Miller was the lead singer of the chorus. "Saw him the other day, covered in grease from head to toe. Looked like a raccoon. He's pouring good money after bad. He'll be broke by spring. Should have just bought a new 4440 like a sensible person." Jed heard the whispers. He felt the stares when he went to town for parts. He knew they were calling it Stone's Folly. But he didn't let it touch him. Inside his barn, with the smell of diesel fuel and the satisfying heft of a wrench in his hand, the world and its opinions faded away. There was only the logic of the machine. A worn bearing had to be replaced. A clogged fuel line had to be cleared. A warped surface had to be machined flat. It was a world of problems that had real, tangible solutions, unlike the fickle weather or the crooked politicians in Washington. He rewired the entire electrical system, tracing each corroded wire, replacing it with heavy-gauge copper, soldering and heat-shrinking every connection. He rebuilt the starter, a motor so large it took 2 men to lift. He flushed the hydraulic system, gallons and gallons of milky, contaminated fluid, replacing it with fresh, clean oil that was clearer than honey. Finally, the day came in the spring of 1980. The engine was back together, the fuel system was primed, 2 brand-new, heavy-duty truck batteries were wired in. Sarah stood by the barn door, her arms crossed, a look of profound worry on her face. Jed climbed up the ladder into the cavernous cab. He took a deep breath, the air cold and sharp in his lungs. He turned the key. The starter engaged with a heavy clunk, and the massive engine began to turn over, slow and rhythmic. Whoom, whoom, whoom. It was the sound of a waking giant. He pushed the fuel pump shutoff in. The engine spun faster. A puff of white smoke coughed from one of the exhaust stacks, then the other. Whoom, whoom. Chug, whoom. Chug, chug. And then it happened. With a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the barn, the Cummins KTAL 1250 roared to life. It wasn't the clean, quiet hum of a new tractor. It was a deep, guttural, earth-shattering explosion of sound. Thick black smoke poured from the stacks, blotting out the morning sun before settling into a steady, rhythmic haze. The entire barn vibrated. The tools on the workbench rattled. Jed felt the raw, untamed power surging up through the floorboards, through the seat, into his very bones. Down below, Sarah put her hands over her ears, but a slow smile spread across her face. It was the sound of victory. It was the sound of life. Stone's folly was alive. The early 1980s began with a surge of optimism that felt intoxicating. Grain prices, pushed by massive sales to the Soviet Union, were soaring. Land values were climbing so fast it made your head spin. The message from the government, from the banks, from the farm magazines was clear: get big or get out. Plant fence row to fence row, leverage your assets. The sky was the limit. Frank Miller was the poster boy for this new gold rush. With Mr. Caldwell at the bank cheering him on, he mortgaged his original farm to buy the Henderson place, then mortgaged both to buy another half-section that came up for sale. He traded in his 2-year-old Steiger for the brand-new flagship model, a John Deere 8850, the biggest articulated tractor Deere had ever made. It was a beautiful machine, with a comfortable air-conditioned cab, a stereo, and more lights than a freight train. He drove it over to Jed's place one afternoon, the engine humming quietly, a stark contrast to the big Bud's thunderous idle. He found Jed in the field, turning soil deeper than anyone in the county had ever seen. The big Bud was pulling a massive V-ripper, its 9 shanks sinking 3 feet into the earth, shattering a hardpan layer that had choked crop roots for decades. "Still playing with that relic, Jed?" Miller yelled over the engines. Jed throttled the Cummins down and climbed out of the cab. "She's doing the job, Frank." "Yeah, but at what cost?" Miller scoffed, patting the fender of his new Deere. "This baby here, she's efficient. I can run all night. Got a computer in the dash, tells me my wheel slippage, my fuel consumption, everything. You're just burning money with that old 2-stroke Detroit." "It's a Cummins 4-stroke, Jed corrected him quietly. "Whatever. Point is, you're thinking small. I just picked up the old Johnson place. Gonna have 2,000 acres in corn next year. The bank's behind me 100%. You should talk to Caldwell. He could get you into a new machine, get you expanding. You're sitting on a gold mine with this land, but you're not digging." "I'm digging just fine," Jed said, gesturing to the deep furrows behind the ripper. "And I'm not sitting on a gold mine. I'm sitting on my own land. There's a difference." Miller just laughed and shook his head. "You're a stubborn fool, Stone. You'll be kicking yourself in 5 years when I'm retired in Florida, and you're still wrestling with that rusty monster." He climbed back into his climate-controlled cab, waved a dismissive hand, and drove away, leaving Jed in a cloud of dust. Jed watched him go, a knot tightening in his stomach. It was hard not to feel a pang of doubt. All around him, his neighbors were getting rich, or at least they looked rich. New pickups, new combines, new houses. And he was here, running his paid-for farm with a 10-year-old 4020 and a resurrected beast from a junkyard. The big Bud was powerful, but it was thirsty. Fuel prices were climbing, and every acre he deep-ripped was a gamble that the long-term soil improvement would outweigh the immediate cost. He stayed his course. He farmed his quarter section, plus another 80 acres he cash-rented. He used the big Bud for the heavy tillage, the 4020 for planting and cultivating. He and Sarah lived simply. They paid their bills on time. They put a little money away. They were solvent, but on paper, compared to men like Frank Miller, they were falling behind. They were failures in an age where debt was a sign of ambition and success. One evening, Jed sat at the kitchen table, going over his account books. On the small black-and-white television in the corner, a news anchor was talking. The picture was fuzzy, but the words were sharp. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, today reiterated his commitment to fighting inflation, signaling that interest rates may have to rise even further. Sarah set a cup of coffee down in front of him. "What's that mean, Jed?" "It means," Jed said, looking out the window into the darkness, "that the bank is about to change the rules of the game." That night, a storm rolled in. A hard, driving rain lashed against the windows. Jed couldn't sleep. He got up, pulled on his boots and jacket, and walked out to the barn. He slid the heavy door open and stepped inside, the smell of grease and steel a familiar comfort. He switched on a single bare bulb, which cast a warm yellow glow over the big Bud. He had spent the last month giving it a new coat of paint. Not the original red, but a deep, powerful Massey Ferguson red he'd gotten on sale. It looked proud now, strong. He ran his hand along the massive engine block, still warm from the day's work. The community saw a relic. Frank Miller saw a joke. The banker saw a write-off. But Jed saw a fortress, He saw £1 million of pulling power that was his and his alone. No bank had a lien on it. No finance company could repossess it. A letter had arrived that day from the bank for Frank Miller, delivered to Jed's mailbox by mistake. It was thick, with an ominous red stamp on the corner that said urgent. Jed had driven it over and left it in Miller's box, but he'd seen the look on his neighbor's face lately. A little more tired, a little more strained. Jed looked at his own reflection in the polished chrome of the exhaust stack. He was a man out of time, clinging to old values of thrift and independence in a world gone mad with credit. He felt a cold wind blowing, not from the storm outside, but from a place far away, a place of boardrooms and balance sheets. Something was coming. He didn't know what it was, but he knew deep in his bones that when it hit, he'd rather be behind the wheel of this paid-for 10-ton beast than in the cab of a brand-new tractor that belonged to someone else. He switched off the light, slid the heavy door shut, and walked back to the house, the thunder rolling in the distance like the sound of a coming war. The summer of 1983 arrived not with gentle warmth, but with the searing breath of a blast furnace. The sky over Iowa turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a relentless personal malice. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, the corn leaves began to curl inward, a desperate, thirsty gesture. The ground, once rich and black, cracked open in a network of fissures, hard and grey as slate. On Frank Miller's 2,000 acres, the devastation was absolute. His fields, tilled with a modern disc chisel that left the surface fine and black, were baking into ceramic. The young corn stalks, deprived of moisture, turned a sickly yellow-brown. Frank spent his days in the air-conditioned cab of his John Deere 8850, the V8 diesel engine humming a quiet, expensive tune as he cultivated, trying to preserve what little moisture remained. But it was like trying to plow a parking lot. Jed, on the other hand, was seeing the first returns on his strange investment. The deep furrows carved by the Big Bud's V-Ripper years before had fundamentally changed his soil. The shattered hardpan layer, 3 feet down, had created a deep reservoir. His corn was suffering, no doubt, but its roots ran deeper, tapping into moisture that Miller's crops couldn't reach. His leaves were still green, albeit tinged with the stress of the drought. He was holding on. Then, in late July, a line of thunderstorms appeared on the horizon, a bruised purple promise of relief. It wasn't the slow, soaking rain they needed, but it was something. As the first fat drops began to splatter in the dust, Frank Miller raced to get his cultivator back in the field, wanting to work the ground before it sealed over. He was halfway across a field when the 8850 suddenly died. Not with a sputter or a cough, but with an abrupt, sterile silence. The digital tachometer on the dash went blank. The stereo cut out mid-song. He turned the key. Nothing. He was a good farmer, but he wasn't a mechanic of this new generation of iron. He checked the battery terminals. He checked the fuses. He couldn't find a single thing wrong. Cursing, he walked the mile back to his house and called the dealer in Des Moines. The service call was $300, plus mileage. The technician, a kid barely out of high school with a laptop computer in a padded case, arrived the next day. He plugged a cable into a port under the dashboard, typed for a few minutes, and shook his head. "It's your main ECU, the electronic control unit," the kid said, sounding bored. "It's fried. Must have been a power surge." "A what?" "From what?" Frank demanded, sweat stinging his eyes. "Who knows? Lightning strike miles away, static build-up. This stuff is sensitive. I'll have to order one from Moline. Be here in 3 days, maybe 4. The part itself is about $2,000. For 4 crucial days, as the rain came and went, Frank Miller's $80,000 tractor sat dead in the field, a silent green monument to his dependence. He watched from his porch as the thunderous roar of Jed's Big Bud echoed from across the road. Jed was running his old 24-foot field cultivator, working day and night to make use of the precious moisture, the Cummins engine barking a rhythm of relentless reliability. There was no computer to fry, no sensitive electronics to fail. If it broke, Jed could fix it with a wrench, a hammer, and a welder. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced Frank Miller's confidence. That doubt became a gaping wound in the fall. The drought had crippled yields across the Midwest. But just as the meager harvest was coming in, the other hammer fell. The grain embargo against the Soviets held firm. The export market, the foundation of the boom, evaporated. Corn prices didn't just drop, they fell off a cliff. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, had jacked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate soared to over 20%. Frank Miller's operating loans tied to that prime rate reset. His payments more than doubled overnight. The letters from Mr. Caldwell at the bank, once filled with encouraging words and talk of partnership, were now cold, formal demands printed by a machine. The friendly banker was gone, replaced by a man under immense pressure from his own superiors in Chicago, a man whose job was now to limit the bank's exposure. The cracks in Miller's empire began to show. He sold his herd of feeder cattle at a loss just to make an interest payment. His wife's new Lincoln Continental was traded for a used Ford Fairmont. He stopped going to the coffee shop at the co-op, unable to face the whispers and the pitying looks. He looked thin, haunted, the swagger in his step replaced by the weary shuffle of a man carrying an invisible crushing weight. Jed and Sarah felt the pinch of low prices, but their world didn't crumble. Their only debt was their monthly electricity bill. They had no land payments, no equipment notes. They ate from their garden, canned their own vegetables, and butchered their own hogs. The money Jed had saved, the cushion he had refused to leverage, was now their salvation. It wasn't a boom time for them, but it was survival. And in the fall of 1983, survival was the only victory that mattered. One crisp October afternoon, Jed was in his barn, grinding the valves on a cylinder head from his 4020. The big Bud sat silent in the corner, its new red paint gleaming under the single light bulb. He heard a truck pull into the yard. It was Frank Miller. He got out of his dusty, dented pickup and walked slowly toward the barn, his hat in his hands. He looked 10 years older than he had a year ago. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't meet Jed's eyes, instead staring at the massive rear tire of the big Bud. "That technician, he's coming out again. The transmission controller on the 8850 is acting up. He says it'll be another $3,000. He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't have it. I can't even pay the fuel bill to finish my beans. Jed, I need to borrow some money." Jed wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked at the man who had mocked him, who had called him a fool. He saw no arrogance left, only desperation. "I don't have that kind of cash to loan out, Frank," Jed said quietly. Miller's shoulders slumped. "Yeah, I figured. Sorry to bother you." He started to turn away, but Jed's voice stopped him. "But I've got a full tank of diesel in that tractor there, and she'll pull your combine just fine." Frank Miller looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Jed to the big Bud, the machine he had ridiculed, the symbol of everything he thought was backward and foolish. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, a single convulsive gesture of gratitude and defeat. That evening, for the first time, the thunder of Stone's Folly was heard working on Miller's land, a strange and lonely sound in the twilight of a dying era. By 1985, the crisis had become a plague. The rolling green hills of Iowa were scarred with auction signs, their stark black lettering like funeral notices. Land that had been valued at $4,000 an acre just a few years prior was now impossible to sell for $1,000. The get big or get out philosophy had become a death sentence. Farmers who had bet everything on ever-rising values found themselves trapped, their debts dwarfing their assets. The local paper was filled with foreclosure listings, a weekly roll call of the fallen. Mr. Caldwell the banker was a ghost haunting the town. The color had drained from his face, his suit seemed to hang off his shrinking frame. He had been the high priest of the boom, encouraging men like Frank Miller to borrow, to expand, to reach for that golden ring. Now he was the undertaker, forced to bury the very dreams he had helped create. He avoided eye contact, his briefcase a shield against the anger and despair of the men he was bankrupting. The notice for the Frank Miller farm auction went up on a cold day in March. It was the biggest one yet, the final spectacular collapse of the county's most ambitious farmer. The sale bill listed it all: the 2,000 acres, the house, the barns, the grain bins, and the gleaming, complex machinery that had been his pride and joy. Jed saw Frank a few days before the auction, loading some personal belongings into a U-Haul trailer. The 8850 sat nearby, silent and clean, waiting for the auctioneer. Frank didn't even look up as Jed pulled into the yard. "Where will you go?" Jed asked, his voice soft. "My wife's sister in Omaha has a spare room," Frank said, his back still to Jed. "Got a line on a job at a warehouse, driving a forklift." The words were flat, devoid of emotion. He heaved a box into the trailer and finally turned around. His eyes were hollow. "You were right, Jed. All this time you were right. I built a house of cards on a windy day. I wanted to be somebody." "You are somebody, Frank," Jed said. "You're a farmer. It's in your blood." A bitter laugh escaped Frank's lips. "Not anymore. The bank owns the blood now." The day of the auction was grey and damp, a miserable drizzle soaking the small crowd that gathered in Miller's machine shed. The mood was funereal. These weren't strangers picking over bones. They were neighbors witnessing a public execution. When the auctioneer started the bidding on the John Deere 8850, a palpable tension filled the air. This was the symbol of the era, the pinnacle of modern farming technology. "All right, folks. What am I bid for this beautiful John Deere 8850, one owner, low hours?" The auctioneer chanted, his voice artificially bright. "Let's start her at 50,000. Who'll give me 50? Silence. The only sound was the rain drumming on the tin roof. Men who once would have fought over such a machine now stared at their boots. They had no money, and no bank would lend them any. 40,000. Give me 40. 30. The auctioneer's voice grew desperate. A lowball bid of 15,000 came from a used equipment dealer from out of state. Mr. Caldwell, standing beside the auctioneer, shook his head grimly. The bank would take a bath on it, but they had to sell. The tractor sold for a fraction of what Frank owed on it. One by one, the pieces of Frank's empire were dismantled for pennies on the dollar. Finally, they came to the land. They sold off the newer parcels first, the ones Frank had acquired during the boom. They went cheap to an out-of-state insurance company. Then the auctioneer announced the final parcel. Lot number 7, the original Miller homestead, 160 acres with house and buildings. A century farm, folks. This was the heart of it all, the land Frank's grandfather had broken with horses, the ground that held his history, his identity. Frank stood at the back of the crowd, his face ashen, watching his legacy be erased. The bidding was slow. A few neighbors made tentative offers, but no one had the capital to go far. Mr. Caldwell looked anxious. The bank needed to recover what it could. Then a clear, steady voice cut through the murmur. $50,000. Every head turned. It was Jedediah Stone. He stood tall, his worn Carhartt jacket deflecting the drizzle, his face calm and resolute. He wasn't bottom-feeding. It was a low price compared to the boom years, but in the collapsed market of 1985, it was a fair, solid offer. It was real money. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 50,000 from Jed Stone. Do I hear 51? The crowd was silent, watching the drama unfold. Mr. Caldwell stared at Jed, a complex expression on his face, surprise, confusion, and perhaps a flicker of respect. This was the man who had bought that worthless big bud for scrap, the man everyone had dismissed as a relic. And here he was, one of the only men left standing, with cash in hand. 50,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked around. Sold, for $50,000 to Jedediah Stone. A quiet sigh went through the crowd. The ordeal was over. As the people began to disperse, Jed didn't go to the auctioneer's table to sign the papers. Instead, he walked through the thinning crowd directly to Frank Miller, who was leaning against a fuel barrel as if his legs could no longer support him. Frank looked up as Jed approached, his eyes filled with a fresh, raw pain. To be bought out by the very man he had belittled for years was the final bitter humiliation. "Congratulations, Jed," he choked out, the words tasting like ash. "You got what you wanted. You can plow it all with your monster tractor now." Jed stopped in front of him, his expression unreadable. "I don't want your land, Frank." Frank stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about? You just bought it." "I bought it to hold it," Jed said, his voice low and steady so only Frank could hear. This land has been in your family for 100 years. It's not right for it to have a stranger's name on the deed." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a blank rental agreement. "You're going to rent it from me," Jed continued. "The lease is for $1 a year. You'll live in the house, you'll farm the land, you'll keep every penny of the profit. When you're back on your feet, and you will be, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid today. $50,000, not a penny more, no interest." Frank Miller stared at the piece of paper, then up at Jed's face. He searched for a hint of mockery, of pity, of triumph. He found none. He saw only sincerity. The dam of pride and bitterness that had held him together for months finally broke. A deep, shuddering sob escaped his chest. The tough, ambitious farmer who had tried to conquer the world crumpled, weeping openly, his head in his hands. Jed put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Go get your boxes out of that trailer, Frank," he said gently. "You're home." In the years that followed, the story of Jed Stone and Frank Miller became a quiet legend in the county. The farm economy slowly, painfully began to heal. The rains returned and prices stabilized. Jed's act of grace had not only saved a man, it had planted a seed of hope in a community ravaged by loss and suspicion. The era of cutthroat competition was over, replaced by a renewed sense of shared struggle and mutual support. Frank Miller, humbled and grateful, worked his family's land with a fury he hadn't felt since he was a young man. He sold the last of his big, complex equipment and bought older, simpler machines he could fix himself. He and Jed often worked together, sharing labor and equipment. Their friendship forged in the crucible of the crisis. 7 years after the auction, on a bright autumn day, Frank walked into Jed's kitchen and handed him a cashier's check for $50,000. The two men, now friends, shook hands, their grip firm and true. The big bud served Jed faithfully for another decade before he finally retired it. It was too old, too thirsty for the modern era of fuel prices, but he couldn't bear to sell it for scrap. He parked it in the main bay of his machine shed, where it stood like a monument. Its deep red paint was faded and chipped, but it wore its scars with dignity. It was a reminder of a time when survival depended not on lines of credit, but on a man's own two hands and the reliability of simple, powerful iron. Jed and Sarah grew old together, watching their children and then their grandchildren grow up on the farm. Jed's son, David, took over the operation, running it with his father's caution but with modern efficiency. He drove a new Case IH Magnum, a tractor full of computers and GPS systems that Frank Miller would have envied, but the farm was debt-free, a principle David had learned at his father's knee. One warm summer evening, Jed, now a stooped old man with hands gnarled like oak roots, sat on the porch swing with his 10-year-old grandson, Lucas. The air was sweet with the smell of freshly cut alfalfa. "Grandpa," Lucas asked, "why do you keep that old tractor in the barn, the big red one? It's so loud." Jed smiled, a slow, creased smile that reached his eyes. He looked out over his fields, a patchwork of green and gold stretching to the horizon. Next to his land, he could see the Miller farm, also thriving. "That tractor, Lucas," he began, his voice a gravelly whisper, "is a history lesson. Back in the day, everyone thought bigger and newer was better. They borrowed money they didn't have to buy things they didn't need, all because some men in suits told them it was the smart thing to do. They forgot the most important rule of farming. This land doesn't care about your bank account. It only cares about your sweat, your wisdom, and your respect for it." He pointed a shaky finger toward the barn. "That old machine taught me that what you own outright is worth more than anything you can borrow. It taught me that knowing how to fix something with your own hands is a kind of freedom. And it taught me that when your neighbor falls, you don't step on him to get ahead. You reach down and you offer him a hand up." The setting sun cast a golden light across the land, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. From the barn, the silhouette of the big bud was visible through the open door, a sleeping giant, its duty done. Its thunder was gone, replaced by the gentle hum of the evening cicadas and the quiet rhythm of a farm that had endured. Jed put his arm around his grandson's shoulder, feeling the steady, living warmth of the next generation, the true harvest of a life well lived. And in the peaceful Iowa twilight, he knew his legacy was safe.